shock. We're going to talk about three perspectives around an event that creates shock. After the shock, before the shock, and during the shock. Three fundamentally different perspectives around a kind of significant or crisis event. Basically, what we're going to run through is how organizational learning has to connect these three perspectives to keep pace with our changing and turbulent, complex world. But our stakeholders throughout our organization and interconnected to our organization get stuck in stale models and approaches. So what does it take to avoid getting stuck? What facilitates forward-looking adaptations as smaller, and often frequently smaller, and then sometimes larger shock events continue to happen? In the end, this raises the key question: why do reliable systems fail? And can organizations build and sustain sources of resilient performance? Resilience engineering provides answers, and those answers might come as a shock. So let's start. Where? You experience a shock, an event. You react. What's happening? How could this happen? We have a record of reliability. That's great. We have increasing efficiency and productivity. Now, the event triggers a variety of difficulties and challenges that we struggle to handle, and disruptions spread. Eventually, everyone breathes a sigh of relief when the crisis starts to ease. Now what? Well, obviously, these kinds of things relative to safety, injuries and deaths, workers and the public, have happened in many kinds of incidents. NASA's Columbia Space Shuttle in 2003, the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979 in nuclear power that got my career powered. Aviation automation incidents and accidents in the 90s. The recent Boeing 737 MAX, only in 2018 and 2019. Hurricane Harvey in 2017. 3 straight years where Houston had a 1 in 500 year rain event. Interesting. How about the Jessica Santillan transplant failure at Duke University in 2003, around the same time as the space shuttle accident? Or a couple of critical adverse events in healthcare that helped trigger the patient safety movement in 1995 in Florida and in Boston. All of these events, right, when looked at carefully, and many, many more, highlight complexities, brittleness, and surprises. Oh, but it's more. Wait a minute. These shocks don't have to be events that harm people. They can also harm the organization and the industry that organization is in. Is this event, is this shock, when you're experiencing it, a viability crushing event? Viability crushing, could it, right, have a massive effect on the organization that has had this crisis? Well, think about it. What just happened, right? We had the Microsoft Cloud and a variety of government agencies hacked this last month. Google had a major outage, December. We have continuing record of ransomware events for organizations and cities. How about the financial world? Flash crashes, a result of the complete computerization of financial trading, such as the Knight Capital runaway automation accident in 2010, a bankrupt financial institution. Or market outages with NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, or the British bank TSB, right? And what's the viability crushing event? Well, the CEO got ousted, so he thinks it was pretty viability crushing. But that bank, right, almost collapsed as a result of a multi-week long IT struggle. Multiple airline IT outages costing hundreds of millions of dollars. Those threaten the financial viability of those organizations. Boeing's accidents, actually, in the immediate aftermath of the second one, threatened Boeing's viability and threatened the viability of the aviation insurance industry, ironically. Or the space shuttle accident in Columbia, right, was a contributor to the cancellation of the replacement program. Or the 3 Mile Island accident that produced a whole industry that's been moribund for the last 40 years. So these things aren't simply about safety. They also affect your organization's health, potential, and growth possibilities. Here's more. The list could go on and on in setting after setting. So let's talk about one in particular that I like because I was connected to it. And second, because it was directly related to the origins of resilience engineering as an approach to safety. So NASA, the Columbia, and its precursors. As I said to Congress, testimony about safety at NASA, the hole in the wing was produced not simply by debris, but by holes in organizational decision-making. What was going on? We had production pressure, right? How do you meet the schedule? We're behind schedule. We need to accelerate launches. We can't delay launches more. Oh, there's this debris strike on launch. And there were a series of them. Neither of these drawings were current in the lead up to the Columbia launch, but were put together later in the accident investigation. What did happen before was, oh, we have these debris strikes on launch. The ET is safe to fly with no new concerns and no added risk. Wait a minute, what? No, actually, it was 100 times more energy than the maximum they thought feasible, and therefore what they had analyzed. It was striking during a different phase of flight and striking different parts of the orbiter. On 3 criterion, it was outside the envelope of engineering understanding. It was way outside, it was way different, and yet it was discounted as being within the norm under production pressure. Well, what had happened before? In 1999, there were 3 space exploration failures, and the independent report there that came out in 2000 basically said increasingly brittle systems under faster, better, cheaper pressure, right? Which helped trigger some of the initial efforts in creating resilience engineering, but also were not acted upon by the organization in timely and thorough ways. And so we had a repeat of that diagnosis in the Columbia accident report. Now, in 2000, when we met about those initial accidents and brittle systems and faster, better, cheaper pressure, this was one of the slides from the meeting out in California. Now, how does this describe your organization? Are you in a changing environment under pressure? Resource pressures and new performance demands? Are you being pressured to drive down costs, work with shorter, more aggressive schedules? Are you working with new partners and new relationships where there's new roles coming into play, often as new capabilities come to bear? Do we see changing skill sets, skill erosion in some areas, new forms of expertise that are needed? Is there heightened stakeholder interest? How are you navigating these seas of complexity that NASA confronted? Now, one of the issues here is, right, faster, better, cheaper pressure, because that was the name NASA actually used for its policy. But it was actually quite descriptive that these things are fundamental and unavoidable. These are all systems under pressure. And that's one of the reasons, along with finite resources, that we can come back and say that the basic diagnosis of all this stuff in those early OOs is, right, that we have a series of crises of complexity and networks with extensive and hidden interdependencies. The slides here indicate a background of growth, and that means success. And you see the spaghetti diagram for one of the major software companies that supports all the software infrastructure that we depend on. They have a fairly decent share of the market, as you can see from their growth curve. And in that process, right, incidents occur and recur. And the realization is failure is due to brittle systems. The systems as designed and operated are more brittle than the stakeholders, designers, and managers realize, but fail less often as some people in some of the various roles adapt to fill the shortfalls and stretch the system performance in the face of smaller and larger surprises. That's the fundamental finding and pattern. So let's understand this as simply as I can put it, going back to stuff I wrote in 83 and 94. And this line I've used for about the last 20 years. The future is implausible, the past incredible, right? 2 perspectives. One, looking forward about risk, right, based on our understanding of past reliability, and the other looking backwards after a shock event has occurred. Right? So we have this simple diagram with the surprise event. Right? And what we see, as I've tried to summarize quickly around the Columbia accident, stories of complexity and hindsight, and oversimplifications leading us to misunderstand, to misread, and to discount the evidence ahead of what's going on, and to misunderstand and misrespond in looking backwards in the aftermath of shock events. The shock event produces dissonance because what its real message is, your model of the world doesn't match the world you're really in. The world you're really in is different than what you thought and had based your system, your role, your activities, your investments, or your withdrawing investments, right, to extract profits. So in that shock, in that dissonance, that there's a mismatch, what do you do? Do you preserve and repair your pre-existing model? It must be right. There's an erratic component. Or do you revise, reframe, and rethink, right, how the world works, how you set things up, how you control safety, what kinds of risks you're facing? And this means in the forward-looking perspective, before shock events occur, how do you recognize, like NASA failed to do before Columbia, that your model of the world is mismatched to the world you're actually in? So let's take our basic diagram and play with it a little bit, because we have three perspectives. We have the during perspective in addition. And the during the event, right, where a variety of people have to confront the challenge, the anomalies, the surprise event, and act under high potential novelty, what's new about this, high uncertainty and a variety of forms of uncertainty, noise, as we see right now in the pandemic, changing tempos and time pressures on operating, and a wide range of threats to be managed, not all of which you can know, which are the most important or highest priority in advance. Now, the other thing to remind you of, it's not just waiting around for one big massive failure event, right? Small shocks are happening all the time. Small incidents are happening all the time. And during the situation, people are adapting to cope with the complexities, right? They are closing the gaps. They are bridging the gaps to make the system work, to recover, to adapt to the circumstances. Obviously, we see that right now in the kind of triage that goes on as emergency medical systems, ICUs, and others are being overloaded. Our history of mass casualty events, but also in the case of the pandemic. So we see the people adapting, anticipating based on emerging signals in order to cope effectively and adapt effectively, and ability, when they do this well, to revise, right, as they understand more about the surprises that they confront. So that we end up with a work as done in order to make systems work. This is our fundamental source of resilient performance. But we don't see that very well from these other two perspectives. Before the shock, it's easy to discount the evidence just like NASA did. After the shock, rationalizations kick in because of the dissonance and also because of the pressures to minimize change. Think of Boeing in response to its twin 737 MAX accidents. So our question is back, how do you avoid getting stuck? And of course, the answer that we've put forward for a long time is study how people adapt to cope with complexity. That's the key source of information. And we're going to expand on that. There's lots of little shocks that get discounted away, right? And when we look backwards after the fact, the past being incredible, oversimplify what goes on during, the challenges they meet, the expertise that's needed, the kinds of coordination and synchronization that's needed. We reduce the challenges, we reduce the cognitive work, the collaborative activity, the expertise that is required in the during process. Now, to pull this all together and say, what are we supposed to do, right? In studying coping with complexity, it's what we're going to do is we need to look at how the system stretches at the boundaries. That pressure, finite resources, and continuing change, often driven by success, means our systems are changing. Right? As a result, but it also means our systems have limits. Even if they're better than before, they still have limits. And there's events that challenge those boundaries of performance. So what we need to look for are events that stress the system, reveal and shift where the edges are, and require someone or something to stretch and adapt in order to accommodate effects and to seize opportunities relative to that viability issue and growth issue. So that's the whole story in a nutshell. Now let's expand it a little bit. Well, why don't we take a shock event that we're all in the middle of right now? COVID-19 is a stress test of adaptive capacities at a global scale. Now, what does it illustrate for us? Almost too vividly and too directly, right? The rolling series of outbreaks has hijacked and challenged society at multiple levels. Human physiology, critical care medicine, emergency medical systems. It brings in particular challenges because of the lags between infections, severe illness and potential hospitalization and recovery or fatality. It highlights how our systems actually have extensive and hidden interdependencies, in particular because we had unappreciated high brittleness in systems across the board, so that our ability to adapt gets strangled because of the interdependencies and the initial brittleness of the system. And we're seeing the effects of that continue to operate as we try to battle the rolling outbreaks. We see major societal asymmetries revealed and fragmentation across units, organizations, jurisdictions, and nations. And in parallel, we've got individual, local, regional, continental, global scales going on, all of which have interdependencies that interact with each other. So it really is a kind of event that's right in our face that reveals the tangled interdependencies across layered networks of systems. And layered networks is the technical area we're talking about in many ways. And it's a tangled layered network. It's not clear cut and easily mappable with many hidden interdependencies. So the stress tests of COVID-19 on adaptive capacities at a global scale highlight the basic ways that adaptive systems can break down. We see decompensation, where there's a saturation of resources, expertise, time, attention, personnel. Right now, much of the challenges for hospitals is a shortage of personnel. We see working at cross purposes, fragmentation across roles and levels, too vividly, I think. And we see being stuck in stale plans that often produce retreat, and interfere with updating, revision, and reframing as we learn, and we need to learn and modify our approaches as we understand more about a novel virus. So here's a little recipe for you to follow. Here's 4 pairs of questions to ask. When there's a shock event, as Mike Tyson put it, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So when you get punched in the mouth, or when you envision how are you prepared when you get punched in the mouth, right? Here's pairs of questions you can ask. Where is there brittleness in the response to shock events we've experienced before that we might in the future? And where is there resilience in these? Where is there adaptation, right, to meet the new aspects of the challenge that that event presents? Now think about that in the context of the pandemic. Where have you seen resilience, right? Obviously in healthcare personnel, to some degree in hospital systems, where hospital administrators now became part of the frontline effort in order to combat the virus. Where is there brittleness in this? Think about the early difficulties in providing protective gear and reorienting supply chains, even though these are not super sophisticated necessarily products. Here's the next pair. What roles are acting to support the front lines? Oh, and by the way, where are the front lines? Because it turns out in these, the front lines might be quite different than what you thought were the front lines. Certainly a variety of hospital administrators all of a sudden found themselves doing real-time decision-making. What roles are acting to constrict and hobble the front lines? Well, there have been many, unfortunately. Everybody has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. So what's surprising about this case? And what's not so surprising? Didn't we have previous infectious disease outbreaks? Didn't we have plans? By the way, the US and the UK were ranked #1 and 2 in the world in having plans in 2018 or 19 in a worldwide survey in the ability to handle a large-scale infectious disease outbreak. Turned out that was quite wrong. So what's surprising and what's not surprising actually turns out to not be what we would have thought in these events, and gives us great clues as to how our system really works and where it's vulnerable, where its limits are, and what kinds of surprises will threaten to undermine its viability. Weren't there dress rehearsals, as I just mentioned? And what happened to learning from these precursors and other signals? Well, actually, we see this. Countries that had experience with SARS and Ebola have actually tended to do better than other countries that had nominally better resources available. So let's run through these, right? In general, where does resilient performance come from? Some people who take initiative and build reciprocity through past tangible experience with surprise. Some people are the source of resilience. When punched in the mouth, how do we respond? Do we respond with coordination, synchronization, reciprocity, solidarity, working together to handle the challenges? Or do we see fragmentation, working across purposes, selfishness, exploitation of the crisis? Before the storms, times were quiet, right? No, they weren't at all. And they aren't now. Fire season is just getting going in Australia. No extreme weather events, critical digital service, outage threats, right? These times are far from quiet on a whole range of fronts, even though we may be focused on one particular one. What that means is opportunities to learn are widespread. Why doesn't brittle collapse happen more often? Because people are the ad hoc source of resilient performance and provide this key ingredient we'll get to called graceful extensibility. It's a necessary requirement for adaptive systems at all scales and of all types. When brittle collapse is visible, how did we get it so wrong? Discounting and oversimplifications have muddied up our models of how the world really works and what our real capabilities and what the real challenges and threats are. Will people learn from this experience? Well, there's a tension, right? Some will retreat and retrench in stale models, while others will pursue new understanding. And we've talked about this, for example, in the book Behind Human Error. So let's go back to our little simple diagram. So here's a couple points for you to take away. One is when you contrast these three perspectives, you start to see a fundamental finding called the novelty inequality. When you're facing a challenging or deteriorating situation, right, the potential novelty is much, much greater than what will be eventually determined as novel after the incident is well over. So what you're facing in the middle of this has a bunch of different potential differences, potential threats, potential modifications you might need to consider. Then afterwards, when we look back with hindsight, and now we know what exactly was different, what twists actually had to happen. A great example of this is procedures, and I've run into this in multiple times with actual events and analyses and reactions after the fact, where someone says, oh, well, there was just these 2 steps in the procedure, and if you had followed those, everything would have been fine. But that's not what it looked like on the ground to the people in the case. In the one case I first dealt with this, they had written the procedure and they knew very well they had never thought about a circumstance they were facing. And so the novelty when you're in it is much greater. Now, you may not see all of it. You may not consider all of it, all of which are, seeing more of it and being prepared to deal with which of it may be critical in the event is part of good process. But this is part of how we get this distortion of how the future is implausible and the past incredible. The second one, everybody is continuing to commit the component substitution fallacy. Now remember, everything has finite resources and you have to make trade-offs. You're under resource pressure, you're under profitability pressure, you're under schedule pressure. Those are real, they don't never go to zero. So as you develop things, you make trade-offs. You prioritize some things over other things. What that means is that when a problem happens, it will reveal component or subsystem weaknesses. The trade-offs and assumptions and resource decisions you made guarantee there are component weaknesses. We can't afford to perfect all components. Yes, improving them is great, and that can be a lesson afterwards. But if you substitute component weaknesses for the systems level understanding of what was driving the event and has occurred already and will recur already at a more fundamental level of understanding, you're missing the real lessons. Seeing component weaknesses is a nice way to block seeing the system properties, especially because this justifies a minimal response and avoids any struggle that systemic changes require. It's very convenient to commit the component substitution fallacy. But in a world of complexity that we started with, and all of those events, whether those were organization crushing or whether those are safety events that harmed people directly, the complexities of the world and the growing complexity penalties that offset our growing capabilities means you got to move beyond the component substitution fallacy. And of the many lessons I hope you may take away from this talk, this is one. We have to stop doing this. Complexity penalties, yeah, I just mentioned that, right? This is what we've been illustrating all along. And the key point here is we can have reliable systems given the past that are highly brittle relative to the future. Brittle means when events challenge that system at its boundaries, its performance falls off or collapses quickly. Now the problem is, especially because of the complexity of the systems we've illustrated, brittleness is visible only in the anomalies, exceptions, and surprises that occur. So you can only check and build robustness and resilience, which are different, right, by recognizing signs of how your model of the world has been surprised by events, that you are not in the world you thought you were in. That events and the response to manage those events are operating outside of the expected envelope. Now, complexity penalty 2, and again, this is a hard constraint. This is not optional, right? These are provable things about the nature of our world. The boundaries of your system are hard to see. They're not where you thought they were, and they move around, right? So you have to track the boundaries, right? NASA had boundaries that were working. Debris strikes were a known risk. They were doing better and better at managing debris strikes on orbit. But the ability to see and respond effectively when something new, something novel appeared, all right, and grew and repeated, right, broke down. So this is a hard constraint. As the complexity of the system increases, the accuracy of any single model, agent's model of that system decreases rapidly. In fact, the only way to actually build a good picture of how your system works and succeeds is by integrating and merging these partial models, partially accurate with gaps and incompleteness and some inaccuracies. And how you pull that together is really important in how you solve anomalies and surprises. So let's step back for a minute because I've introduced a couple fundamentals and just explain them explicitly briefly. And there's plenty of resources you can look at to talk about what graceful extensibility is and all its implications and how fundamental these properties are. Some of these are theorems that have been proved. Graceful extensibility is a positive capability to stretch, right, near and beyond your normal boundaries of function when surprise occurs. It's the opposite of brittleness. And unfortunately, it's not independent of, but trades off with optimality. Your pursuit of optimality, your pursuit of efficiency in the short run can undermine graceful extensibility. That's why we tend to see it and study it in places where surprise is tangible, like space mission control in the shuttle and Apollo eras, or in emergency medicine, especially in beyond surge capacity events. So let's illustrate this in a little animation, right? You develop plans, procedures, right? You design roles, you train people for those. Let's call that your plan. And when you look through the world, look at the world through your plan, it's always springtime. There's always flowers. It's not cold and gray out there. There's no snow anywhere, right? It's green, the flowers are coming, everything looks wonderful. But if we pull the camera back a little bit, right, the perspective of looking at the world through the plan is incomplete. It has limits, right? But we don't see those limits usually. Who sees them, right? The people, the other roles providing graceful extensibility at the boundaries. In other words, that's the dragons of surprise that come and threaten to burn down your lovely garden. And they are out there struggling to tame the dragons. Now we can switch around and take the perspective of the roles that provide a source of resilient performance, who are looking back at the people developing the plans and saying, wait a minute, that perspective, we could use a little help over here. Think about supporting us too. Now, when you look at these two, what the animation show is people, they're not about people. It's not management and frontline. Well, it sort of is, but it's much, much, much more fundamental. These are two properties that all adaptive systems in our biological universe have to have. You have to have them both. You have to develop better and better planful responses to what you understand, what frequently occurs, et cetera. But it will have limits. It has to have limits in this universe. And as a result, you also have to have a capability to respond to surprise, novelty, exceptions, anomalies. Right? They will occur relative to what you prepared for, and what you prepared for will not. What you think you prepared for will be much greater. Will be much smaller. No, yeah, much greater than what you've actually prepared for. Right? You will be overconfident. That competence envelope is bigger, and that the dragons of surprise are infrequent and weaker than they really are. All right. So let's go back to our little diagram again. So we reminded you that shock events are happening all the time. You may focus on a big one because it had a bigger threat, higher consequences, more visibility to stakeholders or the public, but they're happening all the time. These events stress the system. That resilience, that graceful extensibility is a critical property, and it's related to how a system can respond to stress. And all biological systems are adaptive to survive stress, otherwise they won't be viable in the long run. Back to why I showed you viability, not just safety at the beginning. So we want to look at these events as stressors on the system that reveal and shift the edges of our competence envelope, and reveal how and where we get stretching. We get adaptation, graceful extensibility to accommodate the effects, and actually to seize opportunities as well. So let's go back and reframe slightly what we said earlier. The shock event produces information because the shock's about the model. It's not about the consequences. Well, it can be that too, but we're focusing on the shock as your model of the world doesn't match the world you're actually in. The information available in these events can drive revision, reframing, rethinking that model to improve the balance between pursuing, right, the short-term optimization goals of planful response and support the ability to be poised to adapt, have adaptive capacity to be able to express graceful extensibility when challenged. So incidents are a kind of stress test where the system's information about stressors, edges, and stretching as general properties of your system are lost usually, right? As my colleague John Allspaw likes to put it, actual incidents are unplanned investments and opportunities. Incidents are happening all the time and handled, usually, as my colleague Eric Hallnagel loves to point out over and over to us. So how do you get a return on your investment in terms of the information gained and the learning on the sunk cost those incidents represent? Right? How the system works and how we think it works is different. And right, it turns out it has to be that way. Again, that gap has to be there. It can't be zero. Or as Yogi Berra would say, even if the world were perfect, it wouldn't be for very long. The delta, right, is only visible in the anomalies, exceptions, and surprises that occur and in the responses to handle these. That's what we've been pitching in resilience engineering as fundamental from nearly the beginning. So testing for resilient performance uses challenges, edges, instantiated in scenarios to test response capabilities, the ability to stretch, graceful extensibility, for unanticipated situations that stress or have unanticipated aspects that stress the mechanisms imagined to handle those scenarios. That's what we need to do. If we're going to translate all of this into action and real organizations, this is the kind of capability that we need. So, reliable but brittle systems. Why do reliable systems fail? Right? Well, our view looking back is we're more and more reliable. We have great statistics. All of the different challenges we talked about at the beginning, I could run through and talk about the record of reliability that all those organizations and operations had. When we look at what happened after all of those events, right, we see the past incredible. Right? The incidents are interpreted as a failure to work to rule, work to roll, work to plan. That's retreat. That's retrenchment. That's trying to preserve the old model in the face of evidence that it doesn't fit the world in some ways that are important to recognize. So we end up with reliable but brittle systems that are only revealed in the incidents. The brittleness is only revealed in the incidents that happen and is usually hidden by the adaptive capacity of the sum of those people and those roles that provide the source of ad hoc resilient performance. That's the law of fluency. Well-adapted activity hides the difficulties faced and the dilemmas resolved. So why do reliable systems fail? Because organizations confound reliability, robustness, and resilience. They're three separate things, right? Complexity invalidates the assumption that past reliability will predict the future, right? Past reliability is a prediction of the future. Therefore, we don't have to invest in checking and rechecking. We can, as in the NASA pre-Columbia case, under schedule productivity pressure, say those debris strikes on launch aren't a threat because we've been reliable before. Feynman tears this apart in his dissent in the Challenger report. That's how long this kind of stuff has been around. And we're just starting to appreciate and put this into action because our systems keep growing in complexity and the complexity penalties come back to bite us. So systems end up being less robust than we thought and more brittle than we planned on. Reliable but brittle. And so looking forward effectively requires us to get over this, right? We have to recognize when change invalidates the assumption that the future will look like our highly reliable and successful past. Isn't it nice that success kind of drives all this stuff? Unfortunately, it means you can't rely on a record of past success and rest on your laurels. Continuing investment in building fitness to the world, right, is critical for viability and safety. And that's just a hard lesson in our biological universe of adaptive systems. So we're going to do stress tests to assess reliability, robustness, and resilience, the relationship between these things, right? So we ask questions about how changes we plan for the future or may start seeing to operate, produce stresses, move edges, and require new forms of stretching, or lead us to recognize and value forms of stretching we have so we don't undercut them accidentally or incidentally. Looking back at events, we go, hey, those past stressors reveal edges and produce stretching. Let's understand how that worked. Did it work the way we like? Do we want to improve it? Do we want to change it around? How is that going? And of course, we can look at actual events and say, what were the ongoing stresses? What are the edges that are there? What is the kind of stretching that they've been producing? Sometimes we may find the local adaptations, right, have side effects and consequences that we go, whoops, we need to adapt in a different way, in a better way, in a more comprehensive way to the information that we're gaining, right? So change, new capabilities that are grow, the scales expand, pressures intensify, and that helps lead to the complexity penalties. That means the mismatches, the source of information for us to be successful will only be visible in the anomalies, exceptions, surprises that occur, and the fundamental responses to those. So past accidents, current events, future incidents all provide information on stress, edges, and stretching. And that trio, that holy trinity on resilience, if you're going to evaluate, understand, and support resilient performance is what you've got to focus on. Now let's highlight what this means clearly. It means that to have robust and resilient systems, you must be rechecking assumptions and recalibrating your understanding of boundaries and supporting graceful extensibility at those boundaries. So tests for robustness, right? Use cases, use probes, use challenge to gain information to improve the system's competence. Go back to our animations, that competence envelope isn't as good as we thought. It isn't perfect. It isn't as big as we thought. It's got imperfections and irregularities in it. So tests for robustness improve the system's competence because we now understand more about a particular challenge. If a sensor can fail on an automatic system, right, we can be robust in the face of that. And we can do that with fault tolerant sensors. Now, we can't be complete in that. So we can go further in ways and signal the human operator in terms of key information to allow them to intervene should a sensor go bad and feed a bad signal that leads to a misbehaving automated system. In that case, the people can intervene and redirect it. So we have a variety of ways we can build in robustness for a very specific, understood and analyzable form of failure, form of challenge, kind of disturbance we might face. But so that allows us to improve on a set of specific situations that happen to be used in the testing. Now, tests for resilience of a different quality. Now, they still have to use specific probes, challenges, events, failures, conflicts, et cetera. But the information gained is about how well the system will handle the next challenge case when the next case it will face is different from the scenario actually used in the test. Right? Again, the challenges, instantiated in the specific scenarios are sample edges, sample stressors, right, and allow us to see, to reveal, to escape the block of the fluency law and see where and how we have this ability to stretch. Is it right? Is it in a good place? Is it sufficient? How can we sustain it? How can we build its capability without wasting a lot of extra resources? So where have we ended up? Incidents are always being experienced. The nature of this universe, its finite resources, ongoing change, even our success, all right, means that more incidents will occur. They are not going to get reduced to zero. They are unavoidable sunk costs. You don't control the size of this investment. The challenge is to maximize your ROI on that investment. And many of the current processes we follow in organizations minimize or zero the return on investment from this opportunity. All right, incidents are an opportunity to recheck reliability, robustness, and resilience by looking at stress, the relationship of stresses, edges, and stretches. That's where the source of information that allows us to build robustness and resilience, not just rely on a record of past reliability. So can you do this? Is it doable? Well, that's what resilience engineering is about in part. It brings a bunch of other things to bear as well. The techniques are in fact being used to build a system that can continually check and recheck, that can build the capability for being adaptable, being continuously adaptable. If you read into some of the things, especially in some of the areas that are successfully developing and using techniques. Critical digital services, which all of us rely on everywhere, especially when we're all working from home, use and are using and have advanced these techniques in part because they were built on a whole new philosophy on software infrastructure of continuous development and deployment. The issue was how it wasn't about locking down your software and only occasionally changing it, but rather becoming good at change and constantly changing it. Now, not all changes are equal on a variety of things, but becoming good at change, being continuously adaptable. And so they married quite nicely into the directions of resilience engineering. David Provan in Australia has work out on how to redesign the safety manager role to provide guided adaptability. We don't always need adaptive capacity, but when we need it, we have to prepare it in advance. In fact, one of the lessons of the pandemic is places that had prepared and invested in what turned out to be important adaptive capacity were able to do much better than places that had to construct the adaptive capacity in the middle of the challenge event. And that's a finding that goes back, way, way back. Anticipating bottlenecks ahead, building the potential to respond in advance, being poised to adapt. Developing stress, edge, stretch tests as basic engineering steps, fundamental, not shortcuttable. Yes, you can do them coarser grain, finer grain, more thoroughly, a little less thoroughly, but the basic steps have to be executed as basic aspects of integrated systems engineering to get the 3 Rs successfully for modern complex systems. And we're working, and many people are working with various organizations to do more of that. We've done a resiliency trade space study for NASA on drones and controlled airspace. So autonomous vehicles, and identifies, it doesn't simply say, oh, you designed it wrong. No, it indicates where there'll be shortfalls in adaptive capacity, where you need to build synchronization and coordination, especially how do you handle higher tempo situations. So how to build resiliency was one of the outcomes. So it builds on systems engineering techniques and trade space studies, but goes much further in light with the new fundamental findings, the science behind resilience engineering. Based on the science, we've developed new human automation architectures designed for resilient control. So we can actually turn this into equations in some cases at some scales that we've talked about. And this is happening with some degree of energy. There are new companies that are out there growing and working with a variety of organizations or providing tooling to a variety of organizations. There's a startup out of California providing tooling on the software front and on the stuff we've talked about of better learning from incidents. And there are other kinds of companies, including my colleagues, John Alspaugh and Richard Cook, who are providing the techniques to a variety of often high-performing organizations who realize that they need this in order to continue to perform well as they grow, as challenges occur, as competition changes, and that they need to build these in as a fundamental aspect of their organization's operation. Thank you very much.